rounds. So I'll be using the debate super app. You will hear the bell on 1, 6, 7, 7, 15. After 7:15, just wrap up your speech because I'm not going to be writing down anything else after that. Alright, so on the motion, this house opposes the rise of techno-optimism. We can invite PM to start the round. Here.
We already produce enough food to feed the world 2 times over. We have already essentially cured AIDS. We've already got multiple solutions to multiple problems. The vast majority of the world's problems are not problems of finding new technology. It's problems of using technology better. Before I get to my argumentation, I'm just going to argue that I'm just going to explain what the motion actually means. So we prefer a world where individuals are either techno-neutral or techno-wary. This means they might treat new technology with a certain level of wariness. They will still adopt it as individuals always have had in the past. In the 1990s, for example, the vast majority of Hollywood films were actually pretty critical about technology, talking about its potential social ills, with things like The Matrix, for example, being the world's blockbuster movies. But we see in general move towards techno-optimism, a world whereby CEOs like Elon Musk are accorded celebrity status, who have cult-like followings among individuals, where politicians are oftentimes bound by this narrative, and the way that industry communicates its intent and powers to industry and the population and to political elites is shaped by the narrative of techno-optimism. Our case for government is pretty simple. We will explain why this is necessarily an irrational narrative to believe in, and why this necessarily leads towards worse technological progress. Firstly then, why this is necessarily irrational. I've got 2 reasons for this. The first is that when it comes to techno-optimism, speed is of the essence. Techno-optimism presents the need to advance quickly and the ability to move quickly and break things, right? This means that speed is of the essence. But when you have a large amount of emphasis on speed, this means you don't have the time to go and check whether these technologies are acceptably successful or not. You don't have the time to test them, actually roll them out on a small scale, etc. You just roll them out. But the second thing to note here is that individuals buy into it. Think about it. When you're pitching a piece of technology to an investor, you need them to a certain extent, you're talking to a fellow who doesn't understand the technology at all. When you have a large amount of techno-optimism and a narrative of techno-optimism, investors are more willing to invest mass amounts of money into this because they give them the benefit of the doubt, even if they think that this is a bullshit idea on this fundamental level. But even beyond that, individuals dismiss their own concerns. Thirdly, this means that when you have a concern, or when you think that this might not be a beneficial piece of technology, you clamp down on it internally. You think that you're the stupid one. You're the one who doesn't know enough. You don't want to be perceived as falling behind. You don't want to actually fall behind if you think everyone else is investing really, really quickly on all these technologies. All of this means then that the narrative of techno-optimism is necessarily irrational. Countervailing instances are necessarily dismissed. So for instance, the consequences of technology are just dismissed outright because they consider them edge cases or a necessary sacrifice in the process of progress. Yeah. All of this therefore means, no thank you, that this is necessarily an irrational narrative to believe in. What then does this lead towards? And these are my tangible impacts now. The first is that it replaces common sense solutions to social issues with highfalutin, inefficient solutions. In the private sphere, managers overpromise, right? Managers of tech companies can overpromise about the ability of their technology to solve social issues, and because of all the reasons I laid out earlier, investors buy into them and invest regardless of whether it's good pieces of technology or not. What this leads to us is a techno-schizophrenia, whereby investors invest in all of these companies because they fundamentally think that there's a wave of rise of AI, of technology. But all you have to do to get an investor is include AI in the name. That's why in 2021 there was a massive tech bubble, which then leads towards the layoffs of 2024 when investors were asking so much in progress and tech companies were not able to deliver any of their promises because they overpromised. Because none of these technological solutions were possible to begin with. We see the collapse of companies like Theranos, who are criminally liable for frauding investors who were investing like bloody idiots because they think that this is the brilliant new way by which humanity can progress when it really wasn't. Hey, Tesla produces shit cars and yet individuals keep buying them and investing in it. The fact that investors keep doing this despite the countervailing evidence that these are shit cars means that we have terrible investments as a result. No, thank you. But it's not just the private sphere we're talking about. We're talking about the public sphere. When we talk about issues like climate change, for example, we know how to solve climate change. Solar panels have been cheaper than coal ever since 2001, and yet we keep thinking that we don't need to transition to solar panels new technology will solve the problem. We can suck the carbon out of the air. We know that trains are an efficient form of public transport, but America refuses to invest in a rail network because Elon Musk promises a hyperloop and lobbies Congress to make this possible. And Congress can't allow him to do this because senators are not held accountable when the public believes his bullshit. And the reality is techno-optimism allows this massive inefficiency. We already have enough food to help more individuals, but we are told that the solution isn't redistribution of food, it is new technology to produce more food magically somehow, even though we already have enough. All of these are ways by which we create extremely inefficient solutions to the problems that we already can solve today. Yeah.
Do you think venture capitalists working in Silicon Valley are a bunch of stupid idiots who don't know shit about technology?
Yes, they actually are. And they actually are. I don't know how to explain this to you. And it's not just that, right? If you're a venture capitalist, your business is your degree is in business. And no offense, Cavan, but yeah, what ends up happening is you invest in things that you have no idea what are beneficial about, but because you think this is the actual next thing you want to invest in, you invest in it. And outside of the house, we are far more cautious, you are far more careful, you consult more people, rather than trying to get the jump on things, rather than trying to do that as quickly as possible to not fall behind, you now are able to take the time to test these technologies and consider the solutions. We get you so much better solutions on our side of the house. But the second thing to note here is it reduces checks and balances. What this means is that when you ever try to regulate technology, you are seen as a Luddite. The public backlashes against politicians when you try and regulate these companies because they think that companies are the magical key holders to future solutions. Look at, for example, the EU AI bill, where Microsoft was able to lobby the European Union to roll back this bill and neuter it so that you are not able to regulate what images get grounded up into AI. This leads towards people having their news leaked online. And for AI, this leads to artists having their work stolen. This leads to individuals having their lives ruined because AI cannot be regulated as a result. What are the impacts here? Inefficiency allows these social problems to continue festering. It leads towards a lack of progress because now that we invest in everything, we invest in nothing. On our side of the house, when your invested venture capitalists are actually rational, there's no hype train that we're talking about. That's when they do adequate market research. That's when they don't want to fall out and take the time and effort to consider. But on their side of the house, you replace actual solutions with bullshit ones. You invest in the ways by which you can solve climate change through sucking carbon out of the air instead of actually just rolling back your coal plants and ensuring that we have an economy based on solar panels. You harm the most vulnerable. When harms of these things mount, when more and more people die because of the medical technologies that were bullshit, when the bubble of Bitcoin and Terra Luna keeps bursting but people keep investing in it regardless, that's when economies and individuals' lives are ruined, especially retail investors. All of these are massive harms that techno-optimism cripples. On our side of the house, we might have slower progress, where we are far better at getting progress on our side when we actually know why we're investing in things, what we're investing in, and how it helps people. Thank you.
Alright, thank you for your answer, Elo.
Stars in 3, 2, 1. The first thing to start here is, I think if the gov side know that people, for instance, those people are actually over-promising things, I think that people generally also know from the news, right? Those venture capitalists, they're not stupid to know all this kind of over-promising at our side house as well, right? The stance at the op bench is firstly to prove to you why we think that in the status quo, there are necessarily people who have irrational attitude that they take it in a more fearful way towards the technology to begin with. But secondly, we're going to prove to you how this kind of techno-optimism is going to change some kind of perspective, it's going to make people have more investment, and lastly, we're going to talk about the impact of that development to begin with, right? So firstly, on a couple of rebuttals here, I'm going to integrate most of the rebuttal in my speech because I feel like it kind of dependent on the counter depiction in terms of what people feel in general, but also I feel like if they actually want to invest in things like shitty things, etc., I think two things to note here. Number one, I think there are market mechanisms existing, right? For instance, when people know that when they invest in certain kind of when they for instance, they know that they're losing money investing for instance, shitty car that Tesla have provided, they probably learn from that lesson and become more cautious towards this, right? But secondly, there's competition. The competition, for instance, other companies will directly call you out in a way that you are doing things like frauding, etc., right? So we think that people are going to learn from the experiences and have this kind of competition mechanism when they know that they're doing a lot of the fraud. And a lot of time when you notice about that, a lot of this kind of investment is just not sustainable, and they already get outdated by the market mechanism when they feel like they cannot fit into the market to begin with. So, sorry. The first thing to say here is, why do we think that necessarily the counterfactual is far more likely to be people become quite fearful of the development to begin with, right? The first thing to note here is that people generally have the attitude of the fear of the unknown, right? People oftentimes cannot have the ability, for instance, to understand the specific mechanism in terms of the black box of the technology, right? They cannot, for instance, imagine certain kind of like the kind of like technology and how it works to begin with, right? We think that people generally have the kind of a fear of the unknown when they do not know what will happen at the end of the day, right? But secondly, I think that a lot of times, for instance, how the media depict this kind of knowledge is kind of in a negative way, right? It looks like they're going to frame that AI as, for instance, existential risk for a lot of individuals, right? They're going to cherry pick certain kind of sensational stories, and oftentimes it's going to leave people people going to feel quite dangerous about how AI can threaten the life of individuals, how it poses certain kind of risk towards individuals in a way that they're going to directly change the world, that are going to make the whole world kind of like miserable to begin with, right? They're going to cherry picking, for instance, certain kind of very sensational stories to begin with, right? But thirdly, I think that oftentimes when you already see that, for instance, AI is to some degree replacing certain kind of jobs, I think that there's a fear of a lot of the people on the ground in terms of how AI can directly replace their job. They're going to have a very fearful attitude towards how the AI's development can threaten the living of them to begin with, right? But secondly, I think that from the social level, there's also going to be kind of like the fright of the AI to begin with. What's the point?
So if it is true that venture capitalists are smart, that they can do research and have checks and balances, that exists on both sides. And that is also a pretty good reason to invest in the possibility of profit and progress. What technological optimism does is it lets you to dismiss adequate doubt and fling yourself into the unknown rather than taking the necessary precautions.
Yeah, I'm going to talk to that when I later integrate into the social level, right? Because I think that a lot of times, exactly because of the kind of like the fear that people have, is going to make, for instance, the government being quite risk averse to begin with, right? When the government, for instance, know that people generally have a bad attitude towards AI, when they know that, for instance, people are fear of the losing of the job, etc., they're likely to actually do a lot of the regulation to limit the kind of development of the AI to begin with, right? I think that it will actually frighten a lot of investment, right? Because a lot of times, for instance, for this investment to happen, they have to actually perceive this thing in a positive way, right? They have to know that, for instance, the government generally supports certain kind of like policy that is in favor of development of the AI, because a lot of times these investments are being quite sensible in a way that they know how the market goes, they know what kind of policies in favor, in what kind of direction for them to actually make a profit upon, right? That's the moment, for instance, you're going to threaten a lot of, you're going to make a lot of the kind of investment feel fearful in kind of investing in such kind of like corporations to begin with, right? The second thing to say here is we think that a lot of time in the societal level, I think that a lot of the kind of big corporations do have the incentive to preserve the existing technology in a way that a lot of them get patent to begin with, right? Oftentimes they have the incentive to some degree stop the kind of innovation for them to constantly profit on certain kind of technology, and even if they develop, they're not likely to show up, and they're also going to use like the right for them to actually get patent to prevent the innovation of other companies to begin with, right? I think that the second thing to say here is we think that the whole development of the AI itself is quite it's going to consume a lot of the things. That's going to make the whole process of development of the technology quite difficult to begin with, right? What does it actually look like? It looks like, for instance, the initial cost that you have to spend on developing AI is going to be extremely large, right? It looks like, for instance, you have to spend a lot of the money in hiring the experts, in doing a lot of the research, in, for instance, in testing the kind of like the whole process, etc., right? I think that at the end of the day, even if they do make some kind of like progress, the result is going to be quite unpredictable, right? It is not sure that this kind of like the technology is going to be quite fruitful in a way that, one, they might fail, but two, oftentimes we are not sure that whether this application will directly earn you the money to begin with, right? Which means that the whole process of making that technological development quite hard to begin with, right? And I think the second piece of argumentation is upon like how do we think that this optimism is going to change things, right? One, we think that directly change people's opinion. For instance, People are generally going to have like more open attitude towards development. They're going to support more relaxed regulation. They're just going to actually encourage more investment to begin with. But secondly, in terms of how rich people are going to make their investment, they're also far more likely to do the investment. But thirdly, in terms of like corporational decisions, the CEOs are far more likely to agree on, for instance, like changes towards like more innovative ideas, etc., right? I think it's extremely important because if you consider about the technology, oftentimes technology helps people in many ways, right? Because if the problem of the Gulf side is we already have enough resources and it doesn't get distributed well, right? But the problem here is, if you want to distribute well, you have to do, for instance, simulate the real life situation in a way that for it to actually make the efficient decision to begin with, right? This kind of simulation of the ability of simulation of the real life situation requires you to have like computing ability for it to actually test, right? You cannot, for instance, randomly distribute and figure out whether it's effective or not because it's going to be extremely huge amount of cost. But you can do it in a model, right? You can do it in a you can test it in a way that's going to make a lot of distribution quite effective. I think other impacts in terms of why this porting is going to be proven, but I think at the end of the day, we're going to prove that there's going to be a far more efficient way of solving a lot of the real life issues at the end of the day. Very proud to.
Alright, thank you, hello, DPM.
Can I start? The spirit of techno-optimism is actually best observed in the case of cryptocurrency and NFTs, where no one really knows how it works, no one really knows how it will help our lives, but yet people invest millions of dollars into it anyway, yet people are talking about it as if it's the future and the way that humanity is eventually going to progress. They are convinced that it's the future despite there's no evidence, and the point is that techno-optimism is almost like a cult. It is almost like religious-like faith, where even though there's no evidence, when there's no concept or prototype, people just believe in the boundless potentials of technology. We explain that this belief arises from an area that is irrational. We explain that the technology does not yet exist in many instances, so people project their sci-fi-like fantasies onto its potential. People believing that we can colonize Mars or explore the galaxies. But also, companies and tech entrepreneurs overpromise these visions for the future. They use their marketing to project an image that their company can solve any problem in the world. So, if their argument is that people are currently wary, notice that they don't bring it to tech neutrality. They overcorrect for the problem to the point where people are obsessed about tech and have religious-like faith to it. It is not a calibrated kind of cautiousness. It is not an informed or intelligent way of appraising technology. It is often blind and is often overly trusting. This irrationality affects three groups of people. The first is that it affects everyday people like you and I. The existential threat of climate change does not exist if you think that we can absorb carbon from the sky with technology. People don't pressure politicians to control carbon emissions or to tax carbon emissions because they feel as if maybe if we wait a couple of years, Elon Musk will be able to develop something that absorbs carbon from the sky. People don't make changes to their personal lives, like not using plastic bags anymore, because that personal sacrifice seems irrelevant in a world where we could save the entire planet just with technology, because they believe that geoengineering somehow will reverse all of the harms of climate change. But even if technology could save the Earth, it will not be developed fast enough on their side of the house because people pollute so rapidly. The average person does not know the time length on which it will take to develop geoengineering technology, so they just pollute anyways. Maybe the scientists actually need 50 years, but because they're acting so brazenly and because they're acting so irrationally, this means that they end up accelerating us to climate doomsday much faster and the technology never gets developed on their side of the house. The existence of a miracle solution in technology removes the need for sacrifices to be made in the present. Also note, it affects your things like health. People smoking or drinking or eating unhealthily because they believe that somehow modern medicine will be able to save them from all of these things like heart failure. This mindset does not just exist on an individual level, it exists on a policy level as well. What is the point of carbon taxes if we can simply absorb carbon from the atmosphere? We ignore obvious actionable solutions that we can implement in the present because we are overly trusting of an imaginary solution that might possibly exist in the future. And the problem is, it is a low probability that the technology will exist in the future, but techno-optimism makes people weigh the odds wrong. People think that it's a high possibility that human beings can achieve anything. That look at us, we are the greatest species on Earth. It is the absolute hubris and arrogance that exists in techno-optimism that makes them weigh the odds of carbon absorption technology actually existing, and therefore they become overly faithful, trusting in that future. But it was not just the reluctance of society to make trade-offs in policy. It was also states channeling subsidies to subsidize tech firms instead of social welfare policies because they believe tech firms are the future. It was also society wrongly thinking that the problem is that we don't have advanced enough technology instead of problems about distribution. Society thinking that the solution is to invest more money into GMO instead of rethinking the way that food is redistributed. All of this means that techno-optimism has also blinded us to what are the actual problems in society. That maybe it's not that we don't have AI, or maybe it's not about automation. It's the fact that capitalism is a system that hurts individuals. But now, with techno-optimism, people think that they can solve the problems of capitalism somehow if we invest more money into robots. Again, it has deluded us from identifying what are the problems that exist in society. But the other group that it affects is that it affects politicians. Ian explains that it has hurt our ability to legislate technology. There is no political will among voters to implement restrictions, like banning mergers and acquisitions that create tech monopolies. In fact, on their side, it is the opposite. Voters want less restriction and less regulation because they blindly believe that tech firms are the future. The harm here is clear. Once the technology is created, it will be impossible to reverse. Even if we wake up tomorrow and realize that the deepfake is wrong, the technology already exists in the public. Millions of people have the lines of code in their computer and can easily replicate deepfake and spread it on the internet as well. Once the technology is created and published, you cannot reverse it. That ship has already sailed. This looks like generative AI plagiarizing art, but also facial recognition AI being used by authoritarian governments to identify protesters or LGBTQ individuals. Once the technology exists and you realize that it's unethical, it's too late to go back and say you were wrong. And the problem is they always act first and then reflect later, so they only realize the harms retrospectively. On our side, we demand the concept to be proven to us first. We will interrogate the technology and weigh all the possibilities first. We act cautiously first, so we don't wait for the harms to happen and then regret it later when millions of people lose their jobs or millions of people die at the hands of an authoritarian government using all of these facial recognition technologies. But look, even when the technology fails on their side of the house, because they said people are not stupid and can see, even when the technology fails, people excuse failures of technology. They see those failures as an outlier, irrationally. They think that it is part of the process, that the reason why Tesla has rusty cars is simply because Elon Musk is a genius and we need to let him cook for a few more years and the cars will eventually become better. All of these huge failures of self-driving cars literally killing people are seen as smaller problems because people think that, well, eventually we'll reach a point where technology saves us all. The counterfactual is simple. We agree that people will be more wary. This is better than going at breakneck speed and developing something that eventually hurts society. They don't explain why problems can only be solved by technology when there are a series of other alternatives that politicians can use, such as changing the way we distribute food or investing more in social welfare. But even if only technology can help, technology on our side still gets developed as well. We just need more assurance and more concepts and proof before we allow this technology to reach the market. Yes?
Do you think under the current political climate, people and politicians are likely to advocate and support solutions like mass redistribution?
In a world where they didn't have a miracle solution that will somehow create a crop that is super high yield, yes, people would have a greater inclination to all of those other solutions. They're not inclined to it now because they think Elon Musk is going to save them. Last area of discussion, investors. Their response here was investors are not stupid. Look at Theranos. Look at the tech bubble in 2021. These people poured billions of dollars into companies that literally had no prototype and literally had no concept of proof. And the reason is simple. The reason is because techno-optimism is the belief that eventually it will work out. It is the belief that this is the future and we need to jump on the bandwagon now. We need to be the early investors of Google. So even if there's no concept of proof, they act anxiously, they over-index on the potential of the technology, so they don't realize that actually all of these prototypes and concepts are completely redundant. But look, I want to challenge the core premise of their case. Does techno-optimism lead to faster progress? And the answer is no, because it creates more noise in the markets. When all firms are over-promising, it's very hard for you to identify the firms that are actually effective. But most importantly, the tech industry right now is financially oversaturated. Too much money is flowing into the tech industry, which means that a lot of money is going to small and irrelevant firms that are going to amount to nothing. So just because more people like technology does not mean that technology progresses any faster. All of the money is pouring towards all of these wannabe Elon Musk that actually have no concept and just want to pretend to be the next billionaire.
Nikita, Deputy Prime Minister, yellow.
determines our ability to understand the world. It is our capacity to simulate complex systems and forecast the future. It looks like weather forecast systems that are accurate, enabling you to obtain stable returns from agriculture as a farmer. It looks like genetically modified food, increasing food availability, and making redistribution available. It looks like self-driving cars, reducing human errors and reducing car accidents. It looks like large language models, keeping lonely individuals in company and summarizing and crystallizing information to push societal progress forwards. It looks like VR technologies, simulating traumatic experiences to create more empathy and make people wary of experiences that they would not be wary of on the counterfactual, where they're not able to have proximity to these things. This is the difference in this debate. Two things in the speech. Firstly, on technological development. Secondly, on political change. Finally, a little bit of weighing. On technology, their main claim is that VCs are now going to become super irrational. There are two obvious reasons why this isn't the case. Number one, they say VCs invest in everything indiscriminately. Three responses. Firstly, I think that's how VCs operate, right? You have no ability oftentimes to determine whether a form of new technology or true innovation is going to work. You have to sort of take a guess and then estimate whether they're going to succeed in the society. And that is how VC profit. Like, VC profit mechanism is that you invest in 100 different ideas and you do not know if they're going to succeed right now, but as long as one or two succeed, it's going to return exponential profits such that you're able to actually make a profit at the end of the day. Secondly, there's obviously a competition mechanism, right? You need to build a reputation as someone who has invested in successful firms. You need to make returns to stay in the market, or otherwise you will be outcompeted, especially because there are so many firms in this market and this market now becomes hyped. Finally, they say there's noise, but obviously there's clear criteria for success and failure. When you see that everyone is using ChatGPT and it's a product developed by OpenAI, then you know it is a successful giant company. So obviously some ideas fail and do not pass the 1 billion to 10 billion test. Some ideas do not, and they're going to be the ones that more institutional investors are now going to engage in. VCs are just the first step. There are many more investors that are now going to support companies with more mature governance systems. The second thing they say is, this causes bubbles. Two responses. Firstly, I don't really care, because when the Silicon Valley Bank was bankrupted or something, it hurted rich investors anyways. The harm is very limited. The average person and the government doesn't put their pension fund money into funding new tech startups. Secondly, this also attracts more talent to the Silicon Valley, which is a good thing overall, right? Because the thing about bubbles is, most of them fail, but then you get more instances of success, because on the comparative, even though there are fewer bubbles, you would also see fewer successes, because that's just a necessary part of success. You have to experience failure. What does change on our side of the house? As we told you, two important things that are going to limit technological development on their side. Firstly, there's less government support, and the reason for this is twofold. Firstly, as we told you, people already have this existent, irrational fear of the unknown. They fear AI because all of the films they've seen tell them that AI is going to kill them and cause existential risks for humanity. And the reason why they see these films is that they're the most sensational doomsday stories that make people really, really interested. So there's at least a vocal minority that's going to voice out their backlash against this technology, which is going to lead the government to want to regulate, to want to ban, to not want to give the venture capital funds or the technological firms their support. Secondly, as we told you already, big companies don't like other smaller companies to disrupt the current operating mechanisms. No, thank you. So they're likely to oppose this, and they want to patent their existent forms of technology. They don't want new companies to interrupt the market and how it operates. Therefore, because the government is risk-averse, they prioritize maintaining the support of the public over possessing new technology and contributing to economic growth. They're going to not support this or not fund this. Secondly, there's less innovation to begin with for a couple of reasons. The first one is, since your childhood, you no longer look up to being a scientist or being someone who innovates and changes the world and makes a difference. The entrepreneurial spirit is no longer cultivated since your childhood when you see these stories of success, which are glorified on our side, but no longer on their side. When you believe that you're more likely to cause danger than cause good, you're unlikely to choose this profession to begin with. Secondly, as we told you, innovation takes a huge amount of capital, and therefore you need a lot of investors. In a more risky regulatory climate, which exists on their side, you're going to necessarily have fewer investments when it's more unpredictable and dependent on changes in public sentiment. Finally, as we told you, there are many alternative business strategies and models that executives can opt into. So if you're a big company owner, you can choose to innovate. You can also choose not to innovate. So you would err on the side of caution on their side of the house. Why is this very, very important? Because, first of all, technologies are built on top of each other, so it's not as unpredictable as their side wants to talk about. When you talk about artificial intelligence development, there's the neural nets of the 2010s, and then there's large language models like BERT, GPT, GPT-2, ChatGPT. It is an iterative process where you consistently improve on what is previously already built. So it is predictable and it is constantly happening. Secondly, things like computing power and simulation fundamentally determine the level of understanding of the world you're going to possess on their side of the house. Finally, I would just note, there is no moral difference between action and inaction. So maybe by developing a technology, you pose some things, you pose a risk to some things. But by not developing the technology, you further, you do not succeed in alleviating all the suffering that exists in this world. They say regulation is unlikely. We have three responses. Firstly, technological growth is the prerequisite for the ability to regulate. So the faster technology grows, the faster you can sort of detect violations and usage. This is why, like after ChatGPT, there's GPT-0 that you can use to detect whether someone is using ChatGPT for a certain text generation. No, thank you. Secondly, retrospectively, you can do compensation through things like lawsuits, right? I know it is not complete justice, but it's a good proxy. Finally, like I think regulation is limited on both sides of the house for a set of reasons that I'm going to describe right now. Yes?
Last chance. Okay. The desire for profit, competition mechanisms, and need to research exist symmetrically, allowing for the concentrated and rapid rise of the internet in the 1990s, for example, and mass adoption of technology before techno-optimism. Techno-optimism splits your resources across companies which promise nothing and therefore return nothing.
No. Your point is VCs are the same on both sides of the house. Even if that is the case, we told you there are less researchers, less governmental support, less investors who move their capital based on the regulatory climate. Finally, on politics, we would suggest, first of all, that political change is very difficult on both sides of the house. They never mechanize to you how they're going to achieve mass redistribution. Number one, elites want to maintain their power. They control the media. They have the money and connections to decide things. They are funded by corporations who sustain their own interests. All of this makes political change very unlikely when it challenges their hegemony. Secondly, there's partisanship and polarization in the current political climate. So things like the development of social media algorithms, things like people thinking the most effective campaign strategy is radicalizing your own voter base, means that all parties do is parliamentary deadlock. They sabotage each other's proposals and want to make each other not have legacies. Finally, lots of these things are collective action problems, right? So even if one country does this, other countries do not want to. So they offer you very little mechanization as to why they can create political change. We say that is very unlikely on either side. On our side, you have the certainty of technological change that's actually going to alleviate suffering in this world. For that reason, very happy to oppose.
Alright, thank you to Yellow Velvet.
I want to bring Ricky back from space because all the things that we're talking about is progress that is unchecked and not something that's good. The Hyperloop experiment created thousands of miles of tunnels under a juvenile hypothesis that we can slide cars like Hot Wheels through California like the Shinkansen. It is now empty. The tunnels are still there with absolutely no utility even if billions of dollars are invested into it. Those billions of dollars could have been invested into your public transport, into your infrastructure to make sure those things like, for example, traffic congestions are solved. But it is now built upon a thing that cannot recoup, for example. There are two mistakes that Ricky makes. The first mistake that Ricky makes is in the preamble. They say that we are basically anti-tech, but we're not anti-tech. What we are saying is that you need to demonstrate your technology before we adopt it. The same way that we believe in the internet right from the very beginning, or we were wary of the internet right from the very beginning, only until there was a demonstrated product to suggest that we can use it to a large extent, that we believe in the potentiality of it, and therefore it rises. And we don't think that they engage with us. The second thing is that they say that businesses can opt into other models to innovate. We don't think that's how it works. The reason that techno-optimism currently exists also suggests that many of these big business bosses also gravitate towards this particular AI technologies to invest in them rather than opt out into other models. Under their side, it is much likely they are more myopic towards AI models rather than compared to any other models. We think that is bad. I'm going to talk about 3 things here. The first thing I'm going to talk about is how this will improve our attitudes and decision making towards tech companies. The second is how it harms people, and lastly a little bit about finance and recourse that they admit is not good under their side. The first one is on how this will improve our attitudes towards tech companies. Because what we explained to you is that what happens because of techno-optimism is over-leveraging on tech companies, and we think we are investing on potential rather than the demonstrated ability to create change. So, for example, an intuition pump here is that you're rep calling. So when you see a big team out there, right, or a big company out there creating an AI technology, you automatically assume without a product and without a promise that this particular product is going to be something that's good to begin with. What happens as a result of this marketing campaign is that many people will invest into this particular product, ignoring the many other social ills that currently exist, ignoring the many other ways we can channel the finance into. What this means is that we create noise to the extent where we channel monies into places that we don't think it should be, and we don't even know whether we can solve the issues out there. Why we think this is important why is this bad for 2 reasons. Number one, investors invest in bad companies and they lose social capital, they lose social progress. Theranos was heralded to be a medical intervention for the masses. That's amazing, right? But what happens as a result is fraud. And we think secondly also, money is spent and lost. And in the case of crypto, look how many people lost money to rug pulls just because they believe in the blockchain, for example. These are very real examples of where money is lost and where social capital was not gained. They need to prove to us how there is a delta in the progress made to technology if we were more cautious in that regard, and they don't explain that. What was their response to this? They said there are market mechanisms that exist. Number one, I think that's just flimsy response that kind of juvenile debating, but also we think there are 2 scenarios if they do learn about this particular thing. In the best case scenario, they learn quickly, and this is the tech spaces like learn fast, break often kind of situation, right? And we think this particular situation is bad because what happens as a result is that you have many people learning, like creating things and breaking things often to the extent where many money is being funneled into this particular space without a promise of what actually goes on. If there is a saturation of products in the market that claims to solve a similar thing like carbon dioxide, like poisoning or whatever, what happens as a result is that many monies are funneled indirectly into many different spaces, and the concentration of capital is not being channeled into one thing that has demonstrated the particular potential out there. We think this is damaging. But secondly, if they take very long to learn about this particular social ills or this particular scam to begin with, like in the case of Theranos, what happens is the result is demonstrated fraud, and also the inability for you to create a medical intervention because many people invested in Theranos compared to any other cancer research cells and all these things. We think that is bad. How this harms people? A few things. Number one, people are more trusting, and as a result they focus their attention and weight, and in the meantime they choose inaction rather than choose anything else. So that was the important frame coming from our side, because if we believe that Teslas will create the superchargers and like the cars out there that will help power cities and also make cars to begin with, we will not invest in other things, and we will not invest in other technologies that we give chances to, for example. But what happens as a result is that we excuse a lot of quality control issues with regards to Tesla, for example. We excuse a lot of like social ills that we have created from them, and we also preference that particular technology over anything else. We think this is bad. How does this manifest in 2 ways? Number one, in terms of legislation. They said under our side that because we are techno-wary, therefore there will be inaction in the legislature, for example. But what happens on our side is worse, because if there's techno-optimism, many people are more supportive of AI technologies, right? To the extent where Microsoft was able to lobby for the EU AI bill, to the extent where regulation is basically impossible. So if we want to defend a case where it's important, they need to defend the deepfakes, the AI technologies that copy artists, for example, to the extent where it doesn't allow for them to check these particular technologies to begin with. These are areas in which we have created social ills at the expense of actual progress out there. They have never once demonstrated what technology they want and which area they want to improve upon as well. But secondly, when we talk about technology being rolled out prematurely, what this looks like is like people pitching on conceptual ideas rather than actual things, and pitching it to VCs and then funding you to begin with. We think this is bad, and we think that the reality here is that there will be harms that exist as compared to the progress, and they will regret it altogether. They say, without techno-optimism, you will be tech wary or prevent tech progress. Here's how it works. There's kind of a time lag issue. At the point of the 1990s, what happens was that, as I was old enough to experience it, you will have blogspots or what have you demonstrate the ability for you to use telecommunication as a result. And after that, people will be able to therefore appreciate what the potentials of it are and therefore accord critical mass to it right now. But in right now with the techno-optimist situation, you actually create a critical mass before you create the product. And we think that that opposition is actually bad because you concentrate all your efforts into one thing, you ignore everything else, and we think that's what funnels money and capital to different things that we don't think is good. The last thing they said was that, we can sue them. But that's not how it works, right? Like, you can sue them, obviously. You can sue anyone. I can sue Ricky right now. But the point is, like, you cannot get the kinds of outcome that they want because these tech companies are too big. And even if you sue at one point, the tech optimist in you will not think you are worth suing them to begin with. Proud to oppose.
Alright, thank you, Alfred.
Earlier this year, the central part of Japan, Noto Peninsula, suffered massively from the earthquake. Hundreds of thousands of people displaced, thousands killed. And all because the technology of prediction of the earthquake failed. For proposition to say, technological advancement is already done, it's enough, it's about distribution, kind of misses the point of how the world works. Their example of poverty alleviation like food supply is still lacking in many countries. We haven't found out that GMO that is resilient enough against a lot of the droughts that are constantly happening in developing countries. When it comes to climate change, carbon capture is definitely not a solution, but we need some kind of way in which we can reduce carbon emission in the atmosphere. We have to find new technology. When it comes to green energy, we still haven't found out efficient way in which we can create energy greenly. Like solar panel is definitely not the solution, right? We point out that currently there is insufficient amount of technology and that the innovation is what drives society and solves the problem that exists, that is permanent to humanity. 3 questions in the speech. First, I will actually answer to the push of proposition and be wild, right? I will actually explain the cult in technology and irrational investment is actually a good thing. Secondly, I'll explain what happens on guard for the problems that are identified by government. Finally, I'll talk about the speed of development on both sides. First, on cult and irrational investment. Like, government does all the analytical mechanistic work. I'm just gonna add the impacting there. This is not a new material. Don't discredit this. 3 things. Firstly, note that the massive breakthrough, like the internet, like the invention of smartphone, is beyond imagination. Like in the 1990s, when Yao-kun was still a kid, none of us would have imagined how internet would have changed the world, how the social structure would massively change. Yeah. This is a crazy idea. So it would be very irrational for people like Larry Page and Sergey Brin to act, despite having graduated from Ivy school, all of a sudden start this random company called Google. That was such an irrational decision, but an irrational decision was necessary to create this crazy, but out of the mind, very super technology innovation on our side of the house. So proposition assumes that we can just find efficient technology. There's no efficiency in technology. Oftentimes crazy minds change the world. Secondly, what is irrational cannot be determined in the short time frame. Things like the COVID vaccine was only possible because of the foundational medical technology, which was previously seen as useless, but nonetheless became useful later on in the future. Which means that Ian Chai might think that this technology is just very inefficient, maybe, but it might be useful in the future, right? I know these things are very speculative. I know this is a possibility. Doesn't show the likelihood analysis or whatever, but this is just get out of the debate now. We know empirically throughout the course of human history, a lot of the invention has been made. Shipping technology and radio communication in the last century have made possible global trade, which has expanded the capital a million times, expanded a lot of the money and alleviated poverty to a massive extent. Look at the internet that has given access to the voices, the ability for queer community that is otherwise being a diaspora population to connect together, the ability of BLM or Arab Spring to voice their own grievances against the oppressive state is only possible when you have a technology that is innovative, when you have crazy people and crazy minds doing the innovation. Irrationality is actively a good thing. I want to weigh this because I know this is a possibility, but I know in the next 100 years, when you continue techno-optimism, there would be 1 or 2 or 3 of this massive innovation that is created by the crazy minds. one big solution and one big innovation change the world, as I've described already. We think this impact is significantly more important than what Cavan and Wang says. They have two impacts. Cavan says technological advancement when it's too fast is irreversible. But they only give examples, not any mechanistic reason why this is irreversible. They give two. One example they give is a generative AI's copyright violation. I'm pretty sure a lot of the times these open AI is currently being sued, so it's not an irreversible problem. They say facial recognition by authoritarian government, but I'm sure that, a lot of the Western governments are starting to ban the access to supercomputers and a lot of technologies to countries like China and Iran. Like, I just point out, this is irreversible, this is tech dystopia. It's just not based on reality. Secondly, Yelkin says, super train and this, useless investment would have otherwise been spent on public infrastructure and congestion projects. I want to note the context here. Technological advancement only happens in the context of privileged countries. Like, it doesn't happen in the middle of Nigeria. It happens in Japan, South Korea, United States, and these places, which means that the government investment or investors' investment would have otherwise gone to these privileged places anyway. I don't think that's a substantial impact. Anyways, whereas a lot of technology can be distributed globally on our side of the house. Let's then secondly talk about what happened on government. Even if we assume government team to be true, the problem they identified is not in any way solved on government team. There's a severe lack of comparative. They say food supply is a serious issue. They don't show any reason to believe on their side of the house why United States would all of a sudden distribute wasted food to the Nigerian people. Cryptocurrency, like rich people have tendency to invest in speculative investment and shit. Prior to cryptocurrency or techno-optimism, we had a bunch of investors investing into needless mortgage-backed security, which caused global financial crisis in 2008. These are things that are external to this. They misidentified the problem here. Government team provides zero mechanism as to why all of the problem they identified will uniquely be solved on their side. Before I move on to the third point, go.
There's a timeline issue here. The internet, shipping, and trains were all developed during times of techno-warism or techno-neutrality. This means that all the things that the benefits that you're trading everything off for exist on our side as well to equal or even greater extent.
That's such a winery, bad stance, soft stance for you to take. You just conceded throughout your first and second speech that technological development is going to happen more. More investors are going to be willing to invest. Even if it's irrational, would still invest in anyway, which means the probability of achieving something great innovation again, is much higher on our side. The definition is a trick. Alright, final thing, speed of development. I want to be clear. For proposition to win, they had to prove the comparative of on their side, or on our side of the house, we have too fast development, and on their side they have balanced pace of development. But we explained the multiple reasons today this comparative is a false comparative. We explained that in reality, on their side they have the stagnated version of technological development. On our side we have the balanced pace of technological development. So if you prove this comparative, we automatically win. Firstly, we explained that on proposition, there are myriads of factors that are going to be the barriers to technological advancement. Things like the existing corporation trying to block new patents and new innovations. I think the prominent example is NTT and Panasonic in Japan in the 1990s. What they did was they blocked the internet startup company. The reason why Japan is not doing technological well, far behind South Korea, is precisely because of these pre-existing companies' incentive to block many of these innovations. Otherwise, on our side, we need, therefore, many people, many CEOs, many people all around the world to believe that technology is what creates us the future, and this is a far necessary step to tip the balance to our side. So if you want balanced development, what we get is on our side of the house. Thank you very much.
Alright, thank you, Alfred. I'll reply.
The reason why opposition wins is incredibly simple. We're going to weigh our benefits against their harms and show to you why we obviously take the debate. Our benefit is very clear. Government has conceded that technology on the comparative would not develop to a similar extent. That is because people would be tech wary for a number of reasons we described, and they conceded. Firstly, that they would be fearful of the unknown, they would be fearful of things that they cannot predict. Secondly, that big companies in the status quo would maintain their hegemony and try to stifle innovation. So given that, we told you two things about why technology would be less likely to develop. Firstly, that less people would just opt into tech research to begin with, that they wouldn't have the same aspirations, that they would be more rational towards technology in their best case, and not be as crazy as what is required for actual transformative change. But secondly, we told you that there is less crucial government and institutional support, that because of the regulatory climate, which will be much more unpredictable due to the government's necessity to respond to popular demand, there will be fewer investors engaged in this sector. The only opposition response to this is that VC firms will act in a more irrational way and this create more noise. I would note, first of all, that the entire claim they make is dependent on this one example of one company being a fraud, which doesn't really say much about the general pattern under which companies operate. But as we have shown you down the bench, this is just a fundamental misunderstanding of how venture capital firms operate to begin with, right? You can never predict if a product is going to work in advance. You can never predict the ways in which it's going to transform the world. And therefore, as a venture capital company, on both sides of the house, you fund a large number of companies and hope that some succeed to sort of give you exponential returns that will compensate for the ones that actually failed. So the difference is not how venture capital firms are going to invest or behave, but the difference is, number one, how many entrepreneurs you're actually going to get, how many people are willing to get into Silicon Valley, and number two, how many people are willing to put their money into venture capital firms and actually fund this technological change. Why is this the most crucial impact in this debate? We cannot emphasize this enough. Number one, technology is fundamentally how humans understand the world. It is your ability to simulate and understand complex systems like the climate, like how globally food is distributed. It is the system according to which you predict everything. So for humans to gain more control over their fate in this unpredictable world, they need technology. They need innovation. It is the premise of anything else in the world. Furthermore, we would point out it's firstly more feasible than political change as we described, and secondly, the innovation of various technologies is the prerequisite of political change. It is what enables things like the Arab Spring. It is what enables people to be more empathetic because they can access other people's experiences more proximately through things like simulation. What then is their harm? They advance two harms down the bench. Firstly, that technology is not regulated. We say maybe there are more deepfakes, we're okay with that. We transform the world in much more crucial ways and alleviate suffering. I think that's more important. Secondly, they say, and this is I guess their main line from Deputy, there's less political impetus for change. I would just say this argument is highly uncomparative because they have a huge burden. They have to prove that on their side, people are gonna just limit their water usage voluntarily, or they're gonna willingly redistribute their food from rich countries to poor countries, or from the wealthy elite within the country to the general population. We told you about the elite capture and the polarization that exists in the society that casts sufficient doubt on this severely under-mechanized argument. So I don't think you can buy that harm at the very end of the day. What have we shown you? We've shown you that technological development is morally significant because inaction and action is morally, there's no moral difference between inaction and action. On their side, you might feel more guilty for causing slightly more harm, for violating some copyright, for creating more deepfakes. But it is on their side that other issues are not, it is on their side where you do not develop technology, that other crucial issues that affect humanity are not resolved, that suffering is there and you do nothing about it, that you do not alleviate the pain that people on the ground go through on a daily basis. There is no moral distinction between these things, and there's immense potential technology has to actually alleviate that suffering that massively outweighs all of these things. The only thing government team says that makes sense is that Naomi has no Rizz. For that reason, I'm very happy to oppose.
I think you overapplied all the time.
This debate is not about whether technology is good or bad. Technology can be good or bad. It is a question of whether being cautious or whether being optimistic best manages the harms and harness the benefits. Side opposition actually is not debating the area of the debate that is most contentious. Because if it's technology like detecting earthquakes or a weather forecast, there's not much wariness that could possibly be generated about technology like that. It's rather straightforward. We can tell when an earthquake is coming. They have a very broad stroke, assuming that all things from shipping to AI are considered under technology, and all things ever invented by humans are technology. The area of this debate that is most contentious is dealing with technology that are ethically ambiguous. For example, AI, where we do not know the possible implications, where we have not yet thought significantly enough about the consequences of it. And the question then is, in areas where there is ethical ambiguity, do we just proceed and then figure it out later? Or do we first get the assurance? Do we first scrutinize the technology before we legalize it and before we make it public? But it is not just about technology that possibly exists. They also had to reckon with the fact that this debate is about technology as an abstract idea, that in the future, technology will always be able to save us, that no matter what, we can develop something that will be able to save the Earth. It was also about the fact that techno-optimism comprised of human arrogance and hubris, that somehow we will be able to create and invent anything possible. We explained that there are severe harms to these technologies. People lose their jobs, people get pornographic with pictures of themselves created with deepfakes, people die when the totalitarian governments use facial recognition, people die when self-driving cars are legalized. They want progress, they say that technology is important, but at the expense of progress, all of these people are left behind, and once the floodgates are open, you can't reverse it, and you can't undo the harm to these people. Their benefit at best was speculative, because it was never clear on net whether technology would turn out more often good or more often bad. And if the odds are unclear, if you do not know the probability of whether it's good or bad, human rationality suggests you act in a way that is restricted, that you act in a way that is cautious, because you do not know what might happen. But also, their benefits was not mutually exclusive. We had other solutions that would gain more popularity. Obviously, we are not saying that suddenly all of the world will redistribute like food. Obviously, we're not saying that suddenly we'll implement carbon tax. We are simply saying a true claim, which is that these policies will have more popularity, more political will be platformed a lot more often, will be raised in parliament a lot more, in a world where there wasn't this easy solution that existed. So we didn't have to prove the radical claim that they somehow pushed on us that we would redistribute all the food. All we had to say was that these things will be talked about a lot more. But more importantly, their side had an opportunity cost that they never justified. Because for every $1 million that the government spends subsidizing a tech firm that might possibly save the future, they are not spending money on things like social welfare, infrastructure, education, and healthcare. Those things have more immediate proximate outcomes. Those things were more proven to help actual people, as opposed to investing in a potential future that possibly might help. The burden that they had to prove was why techno-optimism led to faster progress. But note, more investment does not mean more progress. There is a huge logical link here. Investment gets diverted to tech firms trying to be the next Amazon. There's more failure and more mistakes. And no, you can't simply say failure is important, because each failure means that millions of people lose their jobs. Each failure sends fissures throughout the economy. Each failure means that money is wasted. They then said, well, this is normal as part of investing because you never know when an idea is going to succeed. Again, simplistic. Of course, if things are prototyped, we don't know whether it will succeed or not. But the least we can do is do research. The least we can do is to think about whether it might work in the future. But none of that research is done because people believe the technology will be useful by virtue of the fact that it's technology. They believe in the potential of the technology because of techno-optimism and not because of evidence. So on their side of the house, the research, the information, all of those things are considered less, and what they believe in more is the cult-like faith of technology. We told you that most importantly, technology will still exist on our side. We invented cars, the steam engine, all during an age where people were wary of technology. The rise is a recent phenomenon, but also we get it slower and safer, and there was no explanation besides examples for why urgency was something that was incredibly important. Just because people are wary of technology does not mean that we make technology illegal. There's a huge missing link here in their case.
Alright, thank you, Governor Pai. That concludes this debate. This is a silent round.
Okay,
So just